So, the poet H.D., whose real name was Hilda Doolittle, H.D. was sort of a pen name, and I think she selected that pen name so that she could publish and not be known as a female poet. She lived from 1886 to 1961. She very much so what you would call a modern American poet. And when she was alive, she was mostly famous because attention was brought to her by a more famous poet named Ezra Pound. While she was alive and while she was publishing, she was considered avant-garde, and she was a sort of an important intellectual of her time. But her rise to popularity really came after her death in the 70s and the 80s, when she was sort of re-recognized by academia. She was a friend of Sigmund Freud, and she went to him for treatment. She didn't need treatment. Well, I don't know if she needed treatment or not, but she was bisexual. And the truth is, she was pretty unapologetic about her sexuality at a time when she would have been scrutinized for it. And because of that, in modern times, she's become sort of an icon for LGBT rights and for the feminist movements. At least that was especially true in the 70s and the 80s. Her poem, I call it Eurydice. Some people call it Eurydice. In fact, most people call it Eurydice. My Greek professors, when I was a kid, called her Eurydice, which 18-year-old me thought was funny. But regardless of how you pronounce her name, her poem's really important for a variety of reasons. The poem is often read through a feminist critical lens. What's the relationship between Eurydice and Orpheus, whose name I don't think is mentioned in the poem, but clearly that's who she's speaking to. You're going to notice her accuse him of arrogance, but I don't feel like that's all of it. I want you to notice that the poem is done in free verse, and it doesn't have traditional poetry capitalization. That's sort of like the beginning of it. More important to notice, and worthy of study though, is H.D.'s use of imagery connected to flowers. She mentions flowers at least 10 times in the poem, and it's a short poem, and it sort of permeates the meaning and message of the poem. It's what we remember from the poem. And it is the difference between the underworld that Eurydice lives in and the world that she almost escaped. So I'm going to ask you two questions. The first is, how does flower imagery contribute to the poem? I mean, us, and I want you to think about that as us, the reader. What do we get from the fact that Eurydice is using all of this flower imagery? But more importantly, I'm asking you to empathize with the speaker of the poem's point of view, and considering the speaker of the poem's point of view, my bigger question is, why does Orpheus look back? The beginning of your answer is the fact that she accuses him of arrogance. And I'm not sure how you want to characterize your answer or develop your answer. It may start with a characterization of Orpheus in this poem, but it also will have to do with you articulating what emotions the speaker of the poem is really trying to convey to her audience. And her audience isn't us, it's Orpheus. So you have two questions. One about flower imagery and how that contributes to the overall effect of the poem on the reader, and this harder question about why Orpheus looks back. And I want that question answered in the perspective of the speaker of the poem. Why? She's not going to say it directly, but why is it she's angry at him for looking back?